For one reason, because of the treatment that he's undergone for all these years, which is shocking and disgraceful. For another reason, because they're attempting to silence it. Those who are attempting to silence it have their reasons, and those are reasons for us to struggle for the opposite. And third, because he has important things to say. All of these things are a true international scandal. Solitary confinement is simply torture. It's been well known for a long time. It's savagery. Mass incarceration is an incredible crime, and a rather recent one, incidentally. There's a lot wrong with incarceration, but the move towards mass incarceration, that really began around 30 years ago. At that time, the incarceration rate in the United States was pretty much in the range of other industrial societies, a little toward the high end, but this is a very punitive society, but not off the spectrum. At that point, it started shooting up. By now, it's 5 to 10 times as high as comparable societies. In fact, about as high as the rate in any society where there are meaningful statistics. And it's not because of crime. The crime rates have remained steady or even declined. This is surely connected with major changes that have taken place in the socioeconomic and political system in the last generation. It's been an unprecedented change in American history. You go back to the origins of our society, which is the richest and most privileged in the world, with incomparable advantages, already was in the 18th century. There has been a steady course of growth, development, a winning of greater rights, industrialization, often in very ugly ways and with ups and downs. But the trajectory's been fairly steady. That changed in the 1970s. The designers of the system, and of course its design, shifted the economy towards deindustrialization, production abroad, offshoring, and financialization. Huge, astronomical growth of financial speculation and other financial manipulations. Well, that's set off a vicious cycle of concentration of wealth, leads to concentration of political power that yields legislation which intensifies the cycle. Ultimately, it gets to the state where we are now, which at last people are talking about. A tiny percentage of the population, actually a fraction of 1%, have accumulated extraordinary wealth. For the majority, it's been a period of stagnation, often decline. People have been getting by, but with higher workloads, indebtedness, asset inflation, bubbles which collapse, and so on. One of the consequences of this is that it's led to a kind of superfluous population. People who simply do not contribute to the wealth and power of the tiny percentage who are effectively the designers of the system. Well, there happens to be a close race-black correlation in the United States that goes all the way back. In fact, if you look over the whole course of African American history, there have been a few decades in which African Americans had some degree of freedom. That was primarily after the Second World War. Big growth period, black men could get jobs in auto plants. There was a period of entry into the society that ended in the 70s.
How does that relate to the state's repression of a singular voice like Mumia, Abu-Jamal's? Why does the state protest so much? Why does Bob Dole get up on the Senate floor? Why does the Supreme Court wait 9 months to hear an obscure case in Ohio so it can apply to him? Why that level of attention?
He's a striking case, but it's far more general. The maximum security prisons in the United States are horrendous. I mean, they make Guantanamo look like a vacation resort, and a lot of it. Same with death row. Executions in the United States are far beyond the norm. There are very few countries, except ones we'd prefer not to mention, which use the death penalty either at all or anything like the U.S. does.
What's the relationship with these very intense human rights violations? These were violations of human rights, whether it's collective punishment, whether it's indefinite detention, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's solitary confinement, torture. What's that relationship to this hegemony?
It goes back pretty far in American culture. It's a very violent history. Blacks are some of the main victims. Native Americans are even worse victims, those who survive. Most of them were, as the Founding Fathers put it, openly exterminated to open up the continent. There's been a lot of freedom won for people like us, more than maybe anywhere in the world, but at a cost to others, serious cost, not just in the country, but overseas, with overseas aggression. The United States also has an unusually violent labor history, much more so than comparable societies. So it's a complex mixture, and one aspect of it is that in many respects it's a very frightened society. Always has been. It shows up in popular literature and the gun culture and so on, and also a very punitive one. And especially in the case of somebody like Mumia Abu-Jamal, a black man who's not afraid, is not subservient. He stands up, says what he thinks. He doesn't bow his head the way you're supposed to, metaphorically speaking. That arouses not only fear but anger. It's not the proper position for a black man. You're supposed to shuffle. You know, in the old days, we don't say that anymore, but the mentality remains. And he refuses. He stands up. He speaks for himself. He speaks eloquently. And the result is very savage treatment. It's a shame. We should, especially in the past 30 years, when the incarceration racket, which is what it is, has gone kind of off the edge, off the spectrum. There should be massive protest over this. There's some, but it should be a lot more. The Puerto Rican independence movement was one of the first targets of the FBI COINTELPRO operations. This is a state terror program, very serious, that ran from about 1960 until roughly 1975, when the courts finally terminated it. It targeted, of course, communists, if they could find any who weren't members of the FBI, Puerto Rican independence movement, all the New Left, finally the entire New Left, the incipient women's movement, small in those days but targeted, and what were called black nationalists, black hate groups. A hate group could be an organizer working in the slums on a breakfast program. And it was a very vicious program that many of us were kind of in one way or another targeted, but the worst were the least privileged. I mean, it reached all the way to political assassination. Fred Hampton, a black organizer in Chicago, was just murdered at 4 a.m. in the morning and killed in his apartment in a raid set up by the FBI. That's a Gestapo-style political assassination, if we're honest. It aroused almost no attention. It happened to, the information was exposed at about the same time as Watergate. And just look at the relative attention given to those two events. Watergate was kind of like a Tea Party in comparison with COINTELPRO. There's certainly nothing like political assassination. So there was enormous liberal outrage over the fact that Richard Nixon had an enemies list. It was calling people bad names in private. And nothing ever happened to them. I didn't know it because I was on the list. Absolutely nothing happened. And of course, no one was concerned because I was on it. It was because I met George Bundy, National Security Advisor, Thomas Watson, the CEO of IBM. You don't call people like that bad names in private. If you do that, the foundations of the republic are collapsing. If you murder a black organizer who's working in the ghetto, well, maybe it gets a footnote somewhere, but let's go on to the next point. These are deeply rooted attitudes. They show up in many respects, and it's a kind of a cultural pathology, social and cultural pathology. And with regard to the treatment of blacks, it's a scandal. It goes back to 1620 when the first black slaves were brought. And it is worth bearing in mind that this entire period, 1620 to today, there have literally been about maybe 3 decades in all of that time when there was a degree of freedom for blacks, the majority of them. Slavery, of course, we all know about. Theoretically, slavery came to an end with the Civil War. And in fact, there were about 10 years after the Civil War when blacks had a degree of freedom. But by 1877, there was a North-South Compact, which essentially guaranteed the South the right to do whatever they wanted with their black population. And what they did was criminalize them. They criminalized black life. So if a black man was standing on a street corner, he could be accused of vagrancy. If he looked at a white woman the way somebody thought it was the wrong way, he'd be accused of attempted rape. Pretty soon you had a huge prison population. Once poor blacks in prison, he'd never get out. Even if the fines looked small, he wouldn't be able to pay them. There's corrupt judges and so on.
Doesn't seem that different than today.
Exactly. We're returning to it. And that criminalization program restored a system which was similar to slavery, in many ways worse. Slave owners at least had some commitment to their property. You had to preserve your capital. If an industry is getting free slave labor from the criminal system, it's fine, we'll do anything we want to them. A large part of the American Industrial Revolution is based on that. Steel, mines, and so on, big industrial revolution in the South. That actually went on pretty much till the Second World War, when free labor was needed for the war machine, and blacks could get jobs. Then after the war, there were about 25 years of very rapid and fairly egalitarian growth up until the 70s. And during that period, there were opportunities for black families to enter the sort of general life. There was also progress, some meaningful progress in civil rights, rights to schooling, voting rights. Not very pretty, as we know, but something happened. And by the 70s, it was over. The civil rights movement could never penetrate to the North. Martin Luther King was a great man, undoubtedly, but his dream was not fulfilled. It was left completely unfulfilled. You hear rhetoric on Martin Luther King Day about, I have a dream, the March on Washington, and so on. That's not when it ended. After that, he turned to the crucial problems of the society, basically two. One was poverty, which is substantially black, but not entirely, and the other was the horrendous war in Vietnam. And as soon as he did that, he lost most of his liberal support.
That actually goes to a short second piece that this Mumia just wrote from his new book that talks about Malcolm and Martin.
Okay. This is from the classroom in the cell, Conversations on Black Life in America, Mark Lamont Hill and Mumia Abu-Jamal, Third World Press, 2011. I'm Noam Chomsky, standing in for Mumia, Abu-Jamal. In truth, none of us are whole, as in finished, for we are all beings who are still in the process of becoming. We are trying to live in the midst of struggle against forces that try daily to confine, constrain, and restrict our being. In a sense, these forces are as powerful, relentless, and invisible as gravity. There, but not there. Dig me? So we seek to heal in a place that is profoundly unhealthy. Consumerism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and acquisitiveness are things that grip us all. We are all fish swimming in that proverbial Dead Sea of materialism, seeking fresh water where we can wash our gills. Our challenge, it seems to me, is to be or become sensitive, feeling, and loving beings who seek to better the environment into which we were born. Speaking of liberal cliches, we must make it better. And it is that very doing that becomes part of our being. For we join in our hearts, minds, mouths, and our bodies in the struggles of those unfree amongst us. In a real sense, we become them. I think that was the life message of folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and why we remember and revere them. We felt them. Martin gave up the ghost for garbage men in Memphis. Malcolm reached out to brothers in the Arab and African worlds and became a part of them. In many ways, they redefined who we were and became a part of us through their impact on our lives and our consciousness.